The air in the Willow Creek Historical Society was not merely still. It was stagnant, a thick soup of dust, decaying paper, and the faint, sweet ghost of old wood polish. For Elara Vance, stepping across its threshold was a physical assault. Her fingers, manicured to a flawless oval and tipped in a no-nonsense pale gray, itched for her clipboard and a bottle of industrial-strength cleaner. She was a woman of systems, of order, of pristine labels and color-coded files. Her life was a series of perfectly arranged boxes, both literal and metaphorical. Chaos was not just an inconvenience. It was a personal failing, and the scene before her was a cathedral of failure. The foyer was a canyon of paper. Stacks of books and loose documents formed precarious towers that leaned against the walls like drunken scholars. A glass-fronted cabinet was crammed with a jumble of artifacts. A tarnished silver spoon nestled against a rusty horseshoe. A porcelain doll with a cracked face staring blankly next to a collection of fossilized rocks. A threadbare Victorian settee was buried under a mound of what appeared to be vintage clothing, from which a faint odor of mothballs and regret emanated. "Miss Vance? A moment of your time, before you begin your purge." The voice was a low rumble, textured with a warmth that seemed entirely out of place. It came from the doorway to what she presumed was the main archive. Leaning against the frame, arms crossed over a chest that was impressively broad beneath a soft, well-worn flannel shirt, was a man. He was, Elara noted with a detached, professional annoyance, devastatingly handsome. His hair was a thick, unruly mane of chestnut brown, streaked with sun-bleached strands as if he spent his days in fields rather than archives. A day's worth of stubble shaded a strong jaw, and his eyes, the color of rich oak, held a glint of sharp intelligence and profound suspicion. This, without a doubt, was Dr. Thomas Aldridge, the historian, the source of the problem. "Dr. Aldridge," Elara said, her voice crisp and efficient. She did not extend a hand. Hers were occupied with her tools of war, the clipboard and a tablet. "I prefer to think of it not as a purge, but as a systemic reorganization. A preservation through prioritization." Thomas pushed himself off the doorframe and moved into the room. He moved with a loose-limbed grace that was at odds with the cramped space, his presence seeming to suck the oxygen from the air. "Prioritization," he repeated, the word dripping with disdain. He stopped beside a teetering pile of newspapers, his hand resting protectively on top of it. "And who, precisely, are you to prioritize our history? This," he said, gesturing around the chaotic room, "is not a mess. It's a narrative. Every layer, every misplaced document, is a sentence in the story of Willow Creek." Elara's smile was tight. "A narrative that no one can read because the pages are mildewed, out of order, and currently serving as a nesting ground for silverfish. The town council hired me for a reason, Doctor. This building is a fire hazard. Its contents are deteriorating, and its grant funding is contingent upon it becoming a functional, accessible public resource, not a hoarder's paradise for the past." The barb landed. A muscle twitched in Thomas's jaw. "I know this town's history better than anyone. I know where everything is." "Really?" Elara arched a perfectly sculpted brow. She tapped her tablet. "The 1890 town census? The original blueprints for the grist mill? The diary of Eleanor Blackwell?" His confidence flickered for a fraction of a second. "They're here. Somewhere." "Somewhere isn't a cataloging system," she said softly, her victory cold and small. "My team will be here tomorrow at 8. We will begin in the main archive. I'd appreciate your cooperation, but I do not require it." She turned on her heel, the sound of her low, practical heels a sharp staccato on the dusty floorboards. She felt his gaze on her back, a tangible heat of resentment. This was going to be a war, and Elara never lost. The next morning, Elara arrived with her small, efficient team, 2 assistants equipped with scanners, label makers, and a seemingly endless supply of clear, stackable bins. The main archive was worse than the foyer. It was a labyrinth of towering, unstable shelving units, each one groaning under the weight of boxes, ledgers, and unidentifiable objects shrouded in dust cloths. Light filtered weakly through a grimy bay window, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air like frantic spirits. Thomas was already there, standing guard over a large, slate-topped desk that was a landscape of its own chaos. He watched, arms crossed, as Elara's team began their work. "All right, team," Elara announced, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "Phase 1, assessment and sorting. For piles. Keep, donate, archive, that's for digitization, and discard. The discard pile requires my final approval." She shot a look at Thomas. "Or Dr. Aldridge's, if he can provide a compelling historical justification." The first few hours were a study in friction. Every item Elara deemed redundant or worthless, Thomas would rescue with a story. "This," he said, snatching a cracked clay pot from the donate bin, "is not just a pot. It was found in the foundation of the old Miller place. This pre-Civil War. It tells us about the indigenous trade routes in this area." Elara sighed. "It's broken, Thomas, and we have 3 others just like it in better condition." "It's not about the condition," he argued, his voice rising. "It's about the provenance, the context. You can't just treat these things like inventory in a warehouse. And you can't treat this building like a tomb for every single object that ever existed in a 50-mile radius," she retorted. "We have to make choices. We have to create a narrative that people can actually understand." The tension was a live wire in the room. Her assistants worked with their heads down, trying to be invisible. As the day wore on, however, a fragile, unspoken rhythm began to emerge. Thomas, despite his protests, knew the contents of the archive with an almost supernatural intimacy. He couldn't always find a specific document on demand, but if you handed him an object, he could tell you its life story. He showed Elara a faded daguerreotype of a severe-looking woman. Sarah Pennington ran the town post office for 40 years. She secretly helped at least a dozen families on the Underground Railroad, using the mail sacks to hide supplies. It's not written down anywhere official. You only know it from cross-referencing her travel logs with letters from a Quaker family in the next county. Elara, against her will, was fascinated. This was different from her usual jobs, organizing a CEO's cluttered calendar or a socialite's overstuffed walk-in closet. This wasn't just about clutter. It was about lost voices. She found herself hesitating over the discard pile, a tattered ledger of farm accounts in her hand. "What about this?" she asked, her voice less sharp than before. Thomas glanced over. "Henderson's Farm, 1881. The year of the Great Flood. See the entries stop in July? He lost his entire herd. Had to sell the land. His son moved to the city." He pointed to a shaky signature. "That's the last thing he ever wrote in it." A silence fell between them, different from the previous hostile ones. This one was filled with the weight of the past. Elara carefully placed the ledger in the archive bin. "We'll digitize it," she said quietly. At the end of the day, her team left, and Elara stayed behind to plan the next day's assault. The room was quieter now, the setting sun casting long, golden beams through the now-clean window. She saw Thomas at his desk, bent over a small, leather-bound book, his large, capable hands handling the fragile pages with a reverence that was unexpectedly moving. She realized, with a start, that his mess wasn't born of laziness. It was born of a deep, all-consuming love. He was drowning in the past, and he saw her not as a lifeline, but as a wave that would finally pull him under. A week into the project, a breakthrough occurred, though it didn't feel like one at first. Elara, determined to conquer the most intimidating section, a wall of unmarked cardboard boxes, pulled one down. It was heavier than she expected, and it slipped from her grasp, hitting the floor with a thud and a crackle of splitting cardboard. The contents spilled out, not papers but photographs, hundreds of them, a chaotic river of black and white and faded color, spilling across the dusty floor. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Elara muttered, dropping to her knees. Thomas was at her side in an instant. "Careful," he said, but the anger she expected was absent. Instead, there was a note of excitement. "I've been looking for these." He knelt beside her, their shoulders almost touching. The scent of him, old books, clean cotton, and the faint, sharp tang of coffee wrapped around her. It was disturbingly pleasant. "The Henderson collection," he explained, his voice eager. "The family I told you about. The ones who lost the farm. The son who moved to the city became a photographer. No one ever cataloged these." He picked up a photograph of a bustling city street, full of Model Ts and men in flat caps. "This is incredible. A visual record of the exodus from rural to urban life after the agricultural depression." For the next 3 hours, they sat on the floor together, surrounded by the sea of images. Thomas provided the context, the stories, weaving the lives of the Hendersons and their descendants into a rich tapestry. Elara, using her tablet, began creating a digital catalog, cross-referencing dates on the photographs with historical events Thomas recalled. It was the first time they had worked together instead of against each other. Elara's order complemented Thomas's knowledge. She created the structure that allowed his stories to be preserved and accessed. "This one," Elara said, holding up a photograph of a young woman laughing, her head thrown back, sitting on the running board of a car. She had a fierce, joyful energy that seemed to leap across the decades. "She's beautiful. Who is she?" Thomas leaned closer, his breath stirring the hair near her temple. He was silent for a long moment. I don't know," he admitted softly. "That's the thing. So many of these stories are already lost. We have the faces, but the names are gone." He looked at her, and his oak-brown eyes were unguarded, full of a vulnerable sorrow. "That's what I'm afraid of, Elara, that you'll organize the life right out of them, that you'll turn their messy, beautiful, tragic lives into a series of cold, hard data points in a database." Elara's throat felt tight. She looked from the laughing woman's face to Thomas's, and for the first time, she saw not an adversary, but a kindred spirit, a man fighting a lonely, losing battle against time itself. "That's not what I want," she whispered. "I just want to make sure they're not forgotten." "We want the same thing," he said, his gaze holding hers. "We're just coming at it from different centuries." In that moment, on the dusty floor surrounded by the ghosts of Willow Creek, something shifted. The wall between them, built of spreadsheets and historical ledgers, crumbled just a little. The truce was fragile, but it held. Elara started bringing 2 coffees in the morning, learning that he took his black and scalding hot. Thomas began to concede that the new, climate-controlled storage for fragile documents was, in fact, a necessary evil. He even helped her assemble the sleek, metal shelving units, his strength making quick work of a task that would have taken her and her assistants hours. They began to talk, not just about the archive, but about themselves. Elara confessed that her need for order stemmed from a chaotic childhood, moving from one rented house to another, her mother's life a series of impulsive decisions and packed boxes. Order was her anchor, her defense against the tumult of life. Thomas spoke of his family, who had lived in Willow Creek for generations. He told her about his grandfather, who had first instilled in him a love for the town's stories, and of his feeling of duty to be the keeper of those memories now that his grandfather was gone. One afternoon, while clearing out a closet, Elara found a large, flat portfolio case tucked away in the back, tied with a faded ribbon. It was unlike anything else she'd seen. "Thomas?" she called. He came over, wiping his hands on his jeans. He frowned at the case. "I've never seen that before." Together, they untied the ribbon and laid the case flat on the desk. Inside were architectural drawings, but they were fanciful, imaginative. Designs for a grand public garden, a library with a domed roof, a series of ornate fountains. They were beautiful, ambitious, and utterly unlike the practical brick-and-mortar reality of Willow Creek. Tucked into the folio was a small, leather-bound journal. Thomas opened it, his eyes scanning the elegant, flowing script. "It's Alistair Blackwell's," he breathed, his voice full of awe. "Eleanor's husband. He was a dreamer, a failed architect. This was his vision for the town. He wanted to turn it into a garden city, a model of beauty and community." He looked up at Elara, his expression stunned. No one knew this existed. The official history paints him as a bit of a fool, a wastrel who lost the family money on pipe dreams. "But he wasn't," Elara said, looking at the beautiful, intricate drawings. "He was just ahead of his time, or maybe in the wrong place." This discovery changed everything. It wasn't just another artifact. It was a key to a new understanding of the town's history. Thomas was electrified. This was the kind of discovery historians live for. He spent the next 2 days poring over the journal, cross-referencing dates, building a new narrative about Alistair and Eleanor Blackwell. Elara watched him, her heart doing a strange, slow tumble. She saw the passion that animated him, the sheer intellectual and emotional energy he poured into his work. He wasn't just messy. He was fully, completely absorbed. And she found she didn't want to organize him. She wanted to make space for him. One evening, as a thunderstorm rolled over the town, they were the last ones in the archive, the sound of rain drumming a frantic rhythm on the roof. The main room was now transformed. The towers of paper were gone, replaced by labeled bins on clean shelves. The artifacts were displayed in well-lit cases with clear descriptions. It was orderly. It was accessible. And Elara had to admit, with Thomas's stories now forming the captions and the digital tours she was designing, it was still full of life. "It's starting to look like a museum," Thomas said, coming to stand beside her. He didn't sound resentful. He sounded impressed. "It's starting to look like it should," she replied softly. He turned to her. The air between them crackled, charged with the electricity of the storm and all the unspoken things that had built up over the weeks. "Elara," he began, his voice rough, I was wrong about you. I was wrong about you too," she said. "Your chaos isn't meaningless. It's love." He reached out, his hand brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was gentle, tentative, but it sent a shockwave through her entire system. Her carefully ordered world, for the first time, felt sterile compared to the warmth of his hand. And then he kissed her. It was not a neat, organized kiss. It was messy and desperate and full of weeks of pent-up frustration and burgeoning understanding. It tasted of coffee and dust and the startling, sweet possibility of something new. Elara's clipboard clattered to the floor, forgotten. Her hands, usually so sure and precise, came up to clutch at the soft fabric of his flannel shirt, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. The kiss changed everything and nothing. The work continued, but now it was underscored by a new, thrilling current. Stolen glances across the archive, hands brushing as they reached for the same document, quiet conversations that stretched long after the workday was over. Elara found herself laughing more, her perfect schedule sometimes abandoned for an impromptu walk as Thomas showed her the town, pointing out buildings and telling their stories, making the history they were preserving come alive outside the society's walls. She saw the town through his eyes now, not as a series of structures, but as a living, breathing character in its own story. The old grist mill wasn't just a building. It was where the town gathered after the flood. The oak tree in the square wasn't just a tree. It was where the first town meeting was held. But reality, in the form of a spreadsheet and a project deadline, eventually intruded. Elara's contract was nearly up. The grand reopening of the Willow Creek Historical Society was in 2 weeks, and her job here would be done. The thought filled her with a cold dread she hadn't anticipated. The thought of leaving this dusty, chaotic, beautiful place. The thought of leaving Thomas. The conflict came to a head over the Alistair Blackwell collection. The town council, thrilled with the discovery, wanted to make it the centerpiece of the new exhibit. But they wanted it streamlined. They wanted the highlights, the best drawings, the most dramatic parts of the journal. They saw a story of failed ambition, a cautionary tale. Thomas saw a man's life's work. They want to cherry-pick his tragedy, he fumed, pacing the now orderly archive. They don't want to show his process, his revisions, his heartbreak. They just want the pretty pictures and the dramatic ending. It's reducing him to a caricature. Elara, standing by her meticulously designed exhibit plan, felt torn. Thomas, we have to be practical. People have limited attention spans. We have to tell a compelling story. His real story is compelling, he shot back, his eyes flashing with the old fire. But you wouldn't understand that, would you? You just want to package it neatly and move on to your next job. Tidy everything up and leave. The words hit their mark, sharp and precise. That's not fair, she said, her voice trembling. Isn't it? He challenged, stopping his pacing to face her. What happens after the ribbon cutting, Elara? You'll pack up your labels and your color-coded bins and you'll go. And this place will just be another completed line item on your perfect resume. What about the things that don't fit into your boxes? What about me? The question hung in the air, raw and painful. Elara had no answer. The future was a blank, white space in her planner, and for the first time, the emptiness terrified her. She looked at him, at this brilliant, messy, beautiful man who lived in the past, and she realized he was asking her to stay in his chaotic, wonderful world. And she didn't know if she could. The 2 weeks before the reopening were the quietest and most miserable of Elara's life. She and Thomas worked in a state of strained politeness. The easy camaraderie was gone, replaced by a chasm of unspoken hurt and fear. She finalized the exhibits, her heart not in it. He buried himself in writing the placards, his prose more academic and distant than the lively, storytelling voice he'd used before. The night before the grand reopening, everything was ready. The Historical Society was pristine. The floors gleamed. The artifacts were displayed under perfect lighting. The digital kiosks were loaded with interactive timelines and Thomas's narrated stories. It was a professional organizer's dream. Felt like a tomb to Elara. She walked through the silent, empty rooms, her footsteps echoing. She stopped in front of the Alistair Blackwell exhibit. She had, in the end, defied the town council. She hadn't streamlined it. She had displayed it all. The triumphant initial sketches, the frantic revisions, the desperate, final entries in the journal as the money ran out and the town laughed at his dreams. It was messy. It was heartbreaking. It was real. She had chosen Thomas's way over her own. She heard a door open and close. She didn't need to turn around to know it was him. "It's perfect," Thomas said softly from behind her. She turned. He looked tired, but the anger was gone from his eyes. "I'm sorry," they both said at the same time, and a faint, sad smile touched both their lips. "I was wrong," Thomas continued. "I was scared. Scared that once you brought order, you'd see there was no place for you here. Scared that you'd leave, and this place would go back to being just a building, instead of the home it's become with you in it." Tears welled in Elara's eyes. "I was scared, too. Scared that my order would stifle the life you love so much. Scared that I wasn't capable of living in a world that wasn't perfectly planned." He stepped closer, his hand reaching for hers. "And now?" She looked down at their joined hands, her neat, clean fingers intertwined with his strong, capable, slightly dust-stained ones. They fit. "I don't have a plan," she whispered, looking up at him. "And for the first time, that feels okay." He pulled her into his arms, and this kiss was different. It wasn't a collision. It was a homecoming. It was full of promise and forgiveness and the terrifying, wonderful, chaotic prospect of a future together. The grand reopening of the Willow Creek Historical Society was a resounding success. The townspeople marveled at the clean, bright spaces, fascinated by the stories they could now easily discover. The Alistair Blackwell exhibit was the talk of the town, admired for its raw, emotional honesty. Elara Vance stood near the back, watching it all. She was no longer an outsider with a clipboard. She was part of the story. The town mayor shook her hand, praising her work. But the highest praise came from an elderly woman who approached her with tears in her eyes. "That's my great-grandmother," the woman said, pointing to the photograph of the laughing woman on the running board. "I'd only ever seen one picture of her, and she looked so stern. I never knew she could laugh like that. Thank you for finding her." In that moment, Elara understood everything. This wasn't about order versus chaos. It was about connection. It was about using her skills not to erase the mess, but to build a bridge to it, so others could cross over and find what was lost. Months later, the Historical Society thrived. Thomas was still the resident historian, but now he had a partner. Elara had opened her own consulting firm in Willow Creek, specializing in organizing small museums and family archives. Her methods were still meticulous, but they were now infused with a storyteller's heart. She still color-coded everything. Thomas still left coffee mugs on every flat surface. Their home was a beautiful, imperfect blend of her order and his chaos. On the wall of their shared study hung two things side by side: one of Elara's first, rigid project flowcharts for the society, and one of Alistair Blackwell's most wildly imaginative garden designs. One was a map of control. The other was a map of dreams. Together, they told the best story of all, the story of them.